There's a hilltop in northern Minnesota where rain splits toward 3 different oceans. Every river in the state flows outward, south to the Gulf, east to the Atlantic, north to Hudson Bay. No major river flows in. Minnesota is the only state in America that gives water away and receives none back. But this isn't just a quirk of hydrology, because everything about Minnesota runs in the opposite direction from what you'd expect, including who its famous progressive system actually works for. In 1973, Time magazine put Minnesota on its cover and called it the place where the American good life has survived in some intelligent equilibrium. And the numbers backed up the praise. Minnesota posted the highest voter turnout in the nation, hovering around 80% in presidential years, thanks partly to same-day registration, a level most states never come close to touching. Its public schools ranked near the top of every national index. Crime rates stayed low. Life expectancy ran high. The corporate base was deep and diverse. 3M, General Mills, Target, Honeywell, Medtronic, companies that didn't just survive under high taxes and strong unions, but thrived under them. That combination is supposed to be impossible. The conventional wisdom in American economics says you pick one. You tax heavily and watch business flee, or you cut taxes and attract investment. Minnesota did neither. It taxed more, regulated more, invested more in public services, and still got rich. The rest of the country looked at Minnesota the way a struggling student looks at the kid who aces every test without seeming to try. There had to be a trick, but there wasn't. The model simply worked. Minnesota became the exhibit case for the idea that a progressive experiment could produce prosperity, not just redistribute it. High taxes funded excellent schools. Excellent schools produced a skilled workforce. A skilled workforce attracted employers. Employers paid wages that generated tax revenue. The cycle reinforced itself decade after decade, and by the late 20th century, Minnesota looked like the closest thing America had to proof that you could build a wealthy, functional, generous society all at once. But the question nobody thought to ask was, generous for whom? To understand why Minnesota built this particular kind of society, you have to start with the water. Near Hibbing, a low ridge called the Hill of Three Waters sits beside vast open-pit taconite mines, craters so wide they swallow the horizon. Rain landing on that single hilltop chooses between 3 oceans. A few inches to the south, and a droplet joins the Mississippi, bound for the Gulf of Mexico. A few inches east, and it feeds Lake Superior, flowing through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence to the Atlantic. A few inches north, and it slips into the Red River Basin, winding toward Hudson Bay and the Arctic. Almost every other state in the country sits downstream of something, a mountain range, a great river, a lake system that feeds it. Minnesota is the upstream. It is the source. The glaciers made it that way. The last ice age scraped the land flat, deposited rich black soil across the prairies, and gouged out a waterlogged landscape unlike anything else on the continent. Minnesota has 11,842 lakes of at least 10 acres, not a rough estimate, but an actual count. It has 69,200 miles of rivers and streams. The Mississippi River begins here as a knee-deep creek you can walk across at Lake Itasca, stepping on stones that barely get your shoes wet. The widest point of the Mississippi isn't somewhere near New Orleans, it's in northern Minnesota at Lake Winnibigoshish, where the river is still young and lake-dominated, spreading lazily across a basin left by melting ice. This landscape shaped a culture. Scandinavian and German Lutheran settlers arrived in waves during the late 1800s and found terrain that reminded them of home, flat, cold, lake-studded, and demanding. They brought communitarian traditions with them, high trust, dense civic organizations, mutual aid societies, a deep aversion to conflict, and a belief that collective responsibility wasn't just admirable, but necessary for survival in a place where winter could kill you. The land reinforced those instincts. Lakes became the organizing unit of social life. Families built cabins, returned every weekend, taught their children to fish and swim and sit quietly in a boat. Going to the lake wasn't a vacation. It was an identity marker, a ritual that bound communities together across generations. Social capital, the web of trust, volunteering, and civic participation that political scientists measure obsessively ranked near the top in the country on every index. Minnesotans joined clubs, showed up to meetings, volunteered at churches, coached youth hockey, and shoveled each other's driveways. It was a culture built on obligation and belonging, and it produced a society that genuinely functioned at a level most states couldn't match. But that culture had a specific shape and a specific beneficiary. Here's where Minnesota inverts again, this time against itself. The state that ranks near the top of every quality of life index for white residents ranks near the bottom for Black and Indigenous outcomes. The numbers are not subtle. The racial wealth gap in Minnesota is the third worst in the country. Median Black family income in the Twin Cities sits around $38,000. White family income runs roughly $84,000. That's 45 cents on the dollar, worse than many southern states that carry far harsher reputations on race. The Black poverty rate is more than 4 times the white rate, even as white poverty in Minnesota runs below the national average. Schools that rank among the best in the nation overall produce some of the worst outcomes for Black and Latino students who are among the least likely in the country to be deemed college-ready in math. The Hennepin County Health Equity Index scores 15 out of 100. In some years, the Twin Cities post the second largest Black-white income gap in the entire United States. Scholars coined a term for this, the Minnesota paradox. Economist Samuel Myers Jr. describes it as a state where world-class education and healthcare make it a great place for white residents, but not for many Black residents. The progressive machinery works beautifully for some people. The schools are excellent, but the excellence concentrates in certain zip codes. The healthcare system is world-class, but access maps onto income and neighborhood. The civic culture is strong, but its networks were built by and for a specific community. What looked like America's best model is simultaneously one of its worst, depending entirely on who you are. If you want to understand how geography and history shape where and how Americans live, subscribe, because the story of how this happened is even stranger than the numbers. Minnesota nice is a phrase most people hear as a compliment. Researchers and residents describe it differently. A culture of conflict avoidance, indirect communication, and coded slights that makes racism extraordinarily difficult to confront head-on. The same high-trust, institution-respecting culture that built clean government and strong schools also made it socially expensive to name uncomfortable truths. If everyone agrees the system works, then saying the system fails you sounds like an accusation, and accusations violate the rules of niceness. This dynamic didn't operate in the abstract. It operated through concrete policy. Redlining carved racial boundaries across Minneapolis and St. Paul. Racial covenants written into property deeds explicitly barred Black families from buying homes in white neighborhoods. Not in Mississippi, not in Alabama, but in Minnesota, the state that believed it had transcended all of that. Some of those covenants stayed on the books until the 1960s. Highway projects bulldozed thriving Black communities to make room for suburban commuters. In St. Paul, the Rondo neighborhood, a corridor of tree-lined streets, Black-owned barbershops and restaurants, churches that anchored an entire community, was raised for Interstate 94 in the 1960s. Where homes and businesses once stood, a concrete trench now carries traffic between downtown and the suburbs. Older residents still describe what was lost, not just buildings, but a network of relationships, businesses, and belonging that took generations to build and seconds to destroy. All of this happened inside a state that believed it was too progressive for that kind of thing. Activist Marvin Anderson put it bluntly, Minnesota has the capacity, the skill, the intelligence to do better, and that's what hurts more than anything. The mechanism is the paradox itself. High social cohesion made it socially costly to name the problem. Dissent felt like disloyalty. Criticism felt like ingratitude. Niceness became a wall, polite, sturdy, and nearly impossible to breach. But the contradiction couldn't stay hidden forever. George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis in May 2020. the global epicenter of a protest movement against racist policing was not in a state known for reactionary politics or segregationist history. It was in the state Time had called the American Good Life. That collision between Minnesota's self-image and what the world saw on camera is what made the moment so devastating. It wasn't that racism existed somewhere hostile and expected. It existed somewhere that had built its entire identity on being better than that. The protests that followed spread across Minneapolis and then the world. The 3rd Precinct burned. National Guard troops rolled the Great Towel through neighborhoods where families had been grilling by the lake a week earlier. Smoke hung over a city that had prided itself on livability, on parks, on clean government, and strong communities. The juxtaposition was unbearable, not just for Minneapolis, but for the entire model Minnesota represented. Decades of top-ranked schools, record voter turnout, generous social services, and civic pride, and a black man was still killed on camera over a suspected counterfeit $20 bill. A police officer's knee on his neck for 9 minutes while bystanders begged him to stop. If this could happen in the most progressive, highest trust, highest turnout state in America, then the progressive framework itself had a structural flaw. Not a bug in the code, but a feature. A system that produced excellent outcomes on average by producing wildly unequal outcomes underneath. The city that topped Best Places to Live rankings also had one of the most aggressive police departments in the country, with use of force rates against black residents that dwarfed the rates against white residents in the same neighborhoods. Minnesota became the national case study for a harder question. Can structural racism persist because of progressive institutions, not despite them? Can the very trust and cohesion that make a society function also make it blind to its own failures? The answer, played out on streets the whole world watched, was yes. How did Minnesota build this unusual political structure in the first place? The answer lies in a party that existed nowhere else. The Farmer Labor Party formed in the 1920s out of an alliance between agrarian populists on the prairies and union workers in the Iron Range mines and Twin Cities factories. On the range, miners from Finland, Slovenia, Croatia, and Italy worked brutal shifts underground for companies that owned the towns they lived in, the houses, the stores, the hospitals. Union organizing wasn't abstract politics up there. It was survival. On the prairies, wheat farmers faced a different version of the same problem. Grain elevator operators and railroad companies controlled prices and shipping, squeezing family farms until they broke. Both groups understood that concentrated economic power without political counterweight led to exploitation. They found each other. The Farmer Labor Party wasn't a fringe movement. It won governorships, sent members to Congress, and shaped state policy for 2 decades. In 1944, a young Hubert Humphrey brokered a merger between the Farmer Labor Party and the Democrats, creating the DFL, the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. No other state has anything like it. The DFL produced a political culture rooted in agrarian populism and union solidarity rather than coastal liberalism, left-leaning but pragmatic, suspicious of concentrated wealth but comfortable with corporate success. Progressive Republicans reinforced the pattern from the other side. Harold Stassen pushed merit-based civil service and clean government reform. Nonpartisan local elections kept party machinery from dominating city halls. The result was a bipartisan consensus around high taxes, strong public services, and institutional competence that survived for decades. No other state locked in this combination so completely. The machine worked, and it worked for so long that questioning it felt almost treasonous. But that consensus was built by and for a specific demographic: white, Northern European, church-going, lake-going Minnesotans whose ancestors had arrived in the same immigration waves. As the state diversified through Somali, Hmong, Latino, and other immigrant communities, the machinery didn't adapt. The institutions stayed high-functioning. The benefits stayed unevenly distributed. New arrivals encountered a system that performed excellently on paper and excluded them in practice, not through hostility, but through networks, norms, and assumptions that had been set in place generations earlier. The progressive brand stayed intact. The outcomes diverged. Return to the geography because it hasn't finished shaping Minnesota's story. That triple drainage, water flowing outward to 3 oceans, means Minnesota sits at the hydrologic headwaters of the continent. In an era of climate stress, shrinking reservoirs and deepening drought, being upstream matters more than it has in a century. Lake Mead is dropping. You've seen the photos, white bathtub rings on Red Canyon walls where the water used to reach. The Colorado River is overallocated, with more water legally promised to users than actually flows in the river. Cities across the Sun Belt are rationing lawns, capping growth, and fighting over rights to rivers that are getting smaller every year. Meanwhile, Minnesota has more surface freshwater than almost any other state, and all of it originates here. It doesn't borrow water from a neighboring basin or pump an aquifer dry. It creates it, from snowmelt, from rainfall, from the 10,000 lakes that sit on the surface like a savings account no one has emptied yet. Climate models already position Minnesota as a potential long-term water refuge within a warming United States, one of the few places where freshwater abundance could actually increase as precipitation patterns shift northward. The state that sends water outward to 3 oceans could become the most strategically valuable geography in a drying country. That's an advantage almost no one is talking about yet, but the math is moving in Minnesota's direction every year the drought maps darken across the west and the south. Demographers are already tracking early patterns of climate migration toward the upper Midwest. People leaving Phoenix, leaving Houston, looking for places where the water still runs and the summers don't kill. But even this advantage maps onto existing fault lines. Environmental burdens, flood risk, industrial pollution, proximity to waste sites are unevenly distributed across the Twin Cities, intersecting with racial and income disparities in neighborhoods that are more exposed and less resourced. The communities least likely to benefit from Minnesota's progressive infrastructure are the same ones most likely to bear the costs of its environmental risks. The pattern holds. Minnesota's strengths and its failures share the same root system, and that root system runs all the way down to the water table. Minnesota is the opposite of every U.S. state because its water flows out instead of in. Its prosperity was built on high taxes instead of low. Its progressive institutions produced some of the worst racial outcomes instead of the best. And its culture of niceness functioned as a wall instead of a bridge. Stand at the Hill of 3 Waters near Hibbing. Rain falls on one hilltop and splits toward 3 oceans. That single image is Minnesota. Everything radiates outward. Everything looks generous and abundant from a distance. But the question the state still hasn't answered is who gets to stand at the top of that hill, and who gets carried away by the current. Thanks for watching. If you found this interesting, check out one of the recommended videos on screen and subscribe.